It's not a debate as much as a discussion from two very different points of view. So Charles Marshall, who you've all heard from at least early this morning, is a professor of paleontology in the Department of Integrative Sciences at the University of California, Berkeley, previously at Harvard and UCLA. Charles received his PhD from the University of Chicago, which is a real hotbed of work in sort of quantitative and analytical paleobiology. And this is actually his first visit to SFI in Santa Fe. So we're very pleased to have him here. And Charles will, I'm not going to say to be defending the biological point of view, but Charles, of course, comes from more of a biological point of view than Jeff West does. Jeff, of course, as a former president of SFI, doesn't really need an introduction. I think you've all heard Jeff before. Jeff came to us a number of years ago from Los Alamos, where he spent most of his career, and is now head of the Cities Project, after winding up a lot of his scaling work that he did so famously with Jim Brown. So what we're going to do is each of them are going to give an some introductory comments, and then we'll have a discussion between the two of them, and then open it up to all of you for questions after I separate the two combatants. Charles, you want to go first?
So first of all, let me say it is a great pleasure to be here. I've never been in Santa Fe before, let alone the Institute. Second of all, let me say that I am going to claim the fifth now, and that will maintain for the rest of the afternoon. I don't know what made me agree to do this. I've known Doug for a long time, about 2.5 decades, and I should have known better. To engage in a debate, I haven't done a debate for years, with an opponent I've never met until about an hour or so ago, on a topic that I'm not particularly familiar with. So, as I said, I'm claiming the fifth.
Yes.
But I did say yes, and I'm going to blame that on my 20-month-old daughter. I've had the lack of sleep. It's a good excuse as any. So what I want to try to do is I speak fairly fast, I apologize, it's the Chicago accent. What I want to do is go fairly fast and try to suggest some questions or issues. Paleobiology, biology in general, tends to be dominated by phenomenology. But I'm very interested in the nomothetic, the search for rules and laws. And so what I'm going to try to do is point you in the direction where I think we might be able to do this in deep time, as opposed to perhaps the more shallow time processes that Jim Brown and others have worked on. So first of all, it's a little bit simplistic, but there are two extremes where individuals matter. One here where they probably don't, and in one case where it absolutely does. Switch the sun off and we're in trouble. So while this is a rather naive dichotomy, I think this dichotomy will play this spread of possibilities will be revisited many times in this short presentation. So I'm going to present about 2 or 3 grand challenges. The first is, to what extent can we develop a nomothetic, that is a rule-based account of the emergence of biological complexity? And I mean in particular hierarchy. And so, biology is dominated by, DNA to cells, organelles, tissues, organs, organisms, ecosystems. And also properties, for example, flight, and including things like URLs. That is, I think a good theory should be able to account for us, that is, Homo sapiens. Another way of rephrasing this is, to what extent can we minimize the need to reference to changes in specific boundary conditions? And I'm intrigued by often complex systems analysis. The system has to be defined quite tightly, and then something unusual happens, and it bounces you out of that dynamic. So to what extent can we develop a theory that enables us to cross between those disruptive disturbances that occur on larger timescales or spatial scales? The alternative is something which we do in biology a lot, which is basically exhaustive description, which I think for an audience here is not especially appealing. Long-term evolution is characterized by very few major innovations. Doug talked about some of these earlier today. The origin of metazoans, of animals, the emergence of land plants, the emergence of animals on land for the first time, the emergence of things like Homo sapien. And the question is, how might we develop a theory to account for this? We also know the Earth system has been perturbed by major disturbances. And so, for example, we can ask the question, what's the role of unique events And can we say anything meaningful about that role? Or are we just stuck as we are with the sun as saying that's part of the boundary conditions, they get reset, and then we start the analysis all over again? So here is just a graph of the extinction intensity of marine genera over the last 500 million years. There do seem to be some generalities. The extinction rates steadily drop as a function of time. So taxa become less volatile. And then there are these major events that seem to punctuate it, of which there seem to be 5 or possibly 3 exceptional events. And in some cases, it looks like they played a major role in the biosphere, wiping out the dinosaurs, leaving the opportunity for mammals and therefore our own emergence. Also, the end Permian completely restructured the marine biosphere in ways that I won't describe in this short period of time here, except to say that the distal core seems to be vast eruptions of lava in Siberia, enough to bury the entire lower 48 states in the order of a mile of molten rock. So that's a vast outpouring and a rare event. I want to talk briefly now about the Cambrian explosion, that is the emergence of the animal body plans or phyla, an attempt I've made to try to find some nomothetic explanation for it. So it's a rather complex event, and I'm going to ignore the complexity and describe it as if it were a single event and simple, with these Ediacaran grade organisms followed by organisms that dominate the world today. Those are trilobites there. The Ediacarans, we don't really know what they are. We don't know whether this is sort of living on the surface or upright in the substrate. Has it got a front end, a back end? And then the Burgess Shale is representative of the post-Ediacaran times with rather more complex organisms, some of which don't look too completely unfamiliar to us. Now, as a foil, I'm going to use Steve Gould's Wonderful Life. Steve actually was the first one to use nomothetic in paleobiology, but I think he cheated. So what he did for the Cambrian explosion is he implied there might be a special genetic mechanism at work. I'm going to argue that is not true. But he also argued if we could rerun the tape of life, we would see an utterly different biota from today's. And in some respects, that's a good test of whether nomothetism works or not. If you were to replace the dynamics, do the dynamics repeat themselves in an orderly fashion? And so the reason why I say he copped out is that his rule is a rule of no rules. He emphasized contingency. And I think we can do better than this. At least we should strive to do better, even if in the end we fail. So here now is an attempt to explain the basis of the Cambrian explosion in a somewhat rule-based mechanism. It's based on an adaptation of a plant paleobiologist at Cornell, Carl Nicholas. And what he did, I'm going to get back to the Cambrian explosion in a moment, is he tried to model plant development. And he had 6 very simple rules. Branching probability on the left side and the right side of the plant, the angles at which the daughter branches emerge from the parent branch, and that's in this sort of XY plane. These dots here are the tips of the branches when viewed from above, and so there's the angles in that extra dimension. So an incredibly simple developmental system. Then what he did, here's a 3-dimensional representation of that 6D space. He initiated it with the parameter values that give you Cooksonia, the first fossil land plant to climb up on land. And then what he did is he applied selective pressures and asked what happens morphologically. So he performed evolution in silico, variation followed by selection. If he selects for reproductive success, seeds are at the ends of branches. So the more branch tips, the more seeds, the higher reproductive success. And the higher off the ground he had a dispersion term, the more fit they are. So one optimal solution doesn't look much like a tree. Select for light interception, branches out horizontally to collect light. If it's tiered, you want to have less branches above overshadowing those beneath. And then finally, mechanical stability, long horizontal branches break off, and that is a bad thing. So not many of these look particularly plant-like. So what happens now when you select for the 3 selective pressures simultaneously? And what happens is the number of solutions go up, and so does their morphological complexity. And then what he did, which I think is really neat, he added in a 4th selective pressure minimizing surface area. On land, desiccation is a primary problem encountered by all organisms. And of course, that's going to conflict with reproductive success and light interception. And this is what you get. Now, what's intriguing about this to me is that as an undergraduate, I wrote an essay arguing also that the genome must be different at the Cambrian explosion. And yet here, as we go from simple plants to complex plants, there is no fundamental change in the genomic system at all, 0, zip. The only change is in the complexity of the selective regime. And a phrase I like to use for this is the principle of frustration running off the Kaufmanian type spin glass ideas. Notice that this is not conflict at the genomic level, at the allelic level. It's conflict at the natural selection level, which is not where Stewart would have placed it. So now going back to these Ediacarans, I won't present the data here, but there's abundant evidence now that most of the key developmental genes used by the animal phyla predate the animal phyla. And I can show you those data if you like. So the potential's there, why not the complexity? And so I gave some lectures down at MIT to a bunch of undergraduates where I was more inclined to confess my prejudices, and so here's my prejudice. I don't find these very interesting. And the reason why I don't find them very interesting is I like complexity, full-rig sailing ships, vertebrate skeletons, and these don't have any knobs and bobs on them. And then it occurred to me that they don't have any knobs and bobs on them. There are no macroscopic eyes, claws, setae, antenna, armor, bite marks. They don't have any organs of interaction for interacting with things of a similar size. They're filter feeding or feeding off bacterial mats. So the selective regime they see at the morphological level is incredibly simple. So what I think drove the Cambrian explosion then is the invention of complex interaction between these sort of organisms. I can't explain that. I need to do something ideographic, introduce some special feature like an organism working out that these beefsteaks are sitting on the seafloor and now are now available as a resource to be ate. So I think it's the invention of food webs. So here's a simple food web. You guys here, I think, are familiar with these. Beautiful, complex food webs in just one small pond. And then I like this one as well. A simplified food web of the Northwest Atlantic. Now, as Homo sapiens, we're relatively immune from these interactions, but most species are not. So I'd argue that what happens is that the invention of ecology extracts out the latent potential sitting within the genome. So the capacity's there. I forgot my notes. It doesn't evolve there, but it's this ecological interactions that creates the Cambrian explosion. Now, Stewart explained the Cambrian explosion as basically the initial exploration of a rugged fitness landscape, without explaining why it's rugged and having any sense of how long it takes. My view, in fact, is that the ruggedness comes from frustration, that is, more competing selective pressures due to the invention of ecology, and that the exploration is essentially complete. I think evolution can solve the NP-hard problem of searching hard or complex fitness landscapes in order 10 million years, and I can defend that if you'd like. And so I think there's a complexifying of the landscape prior to the origin of metazoans, and then the Cambrian explosion goes from a smooth to a rugged landscape and the exploration of that by the organisms. Interestingly, you can't see the increasing complexity of a fitness landscape if it remains smooth. So the Ediacaran beasts just sit there all along at their fitness peak, and then it roughens, and then the Cambrian explosion happens fast. Okay, nearly done. Second challenge. This view suggests that the Cambrian explosion is primarily pre-adaptive. You have to accumulate the capacity for metazoan complexity before you evolve metazoans. And so in the fossil record, my argument would be that most major innovation is pre-adaptive, not adaptive. So you develop a latent potential very deeply, and then you extract it. And you might argue, I think Doyle at Caltech's argued this a little bit with the Caltech, with the TP-ICP type arguments. I would also argue that most biologists, by working in real time, only actually study adaptation. Small changes that species can respond in very fast time, and don't actually study what matters most, which is pre-adaptation, that latent potential. So I would like to see a theoretical biology that includes the pre-adaptive component in a more than simply descriptive terms that I've just given you here. And finally, last story, stemming very much from the tremendous talk we had last night from Brian. When do specific properties and histories of species matter? Does future history depend on me or just someone? And I'm going to give you a very, very simple example, but it relates to the evolution of food webs. So it turns out that there are just 4 ways of being a large mammalian carnivore. Dogs have a bunch of premolars that are small. Then they have molars, and the anterior part of the first molar is a slicing blade, the carnassial. So they can slice meat and they can grind vegetable material. So coyotes, etc., are omnivores. The second type are the hypercarnivores, the meat specialists, they have no grinding surface and just a cutting blade. So if you're frustrated with your cat that won't chew its pills, well, it can't because it hasn't got any grinding surfaces. It's just got slicing blades. The third time are the bone crackers that have increased premolars for cracking the bone and then just slicing blades. And the fourth are things like bears that have no slicing blade, increased molars, and decreased premolars. So you can measure a bunch of quantitative characters. You can plot it out into a morphospace and take a standard 2D slice of it. And you find that over about 43 taxa, that the different morphotypes fall into distinct space, so you can recognize them. So today here, the hypercarnivores, the big cats. Now, if you go to the fossil record, what you find interesting is that the hypercarnivores have always been there in Yellowstone, but in the Pliocene and the Oligocene, there were two completely different groups of canid. They drove themselves to extinction, and then eventually the cats took over the role. So there, me isn't very important there. As long as I have a pool of carnivores, whatever group's available will occupy the hypercarnivore slice. And then I think when we're going to talk about the role of the nomothetic versus the non-nomothetic, the idiographic, I conclude with this. This is Ardipithecus from Tim White's group. And here we have a rather unique individual with a rather unique history that will unfold leading eventually to us. And so are we going to be stuck forever with just a narrative of how our species emerged, or can we do better than that? So history dominates, individuals dominate. It'd be nice to me theoretically if it dominated less, but I'm not sure how to do it in these areas. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. Geoffrey?
Well,
Do we need to switch?
do you switch it automatically? Oh, you can switch it.
Right.
Good, very good.
That's just softening me up, isn't it?
No, this is for something completely different.
Does he
needless to
swing his
say.
arms when he talks?
Oh, I didn't want that up yet, but you can leave it up. It's actually from the instructions, so to speak. It was on the blurb that I guess Doug and Chris wrote for this meeting, and I wanted to just take out a couple of pieces of it and use it in a moment as a point of departure for ruminating on this question of individuals versus the collective, a subject about which I have thought very little, frankly, certainly in my work professionally, and when I like like you, Charles, I just sort of cavalierly said, "Sure, why not?" and then regretted it deeply as this started to approach. But it was very interesting, actually, to start to think in these terms, because a physicist, I of course speak personally, but I think it's generally true, physicists don't think in those terms, and they certainly are very complementary to the kind of story that Charles just said, where everything is, well, everything, a large part of what we see and a large part of the dynamics is historically contingent. So here's the statement that we were given at the beginning, and it spurred two things in me. First, I don't agree maybe I'm misinterpreting that last sentence of the first paragraph. Physics, to take an extreme case, generally ignores individual constituents of a system and progresses by analyzing the aggregate properties of a large collection of individuals. I don't think that's true. Physics does do that, of course, but it also spends an enormous amount of time looking at the individual constituents and understanding the dynamics, the properties, the symmetries, and so on. In fact, Murray has left, but Murray got his Nobel Prize for doing exactly that. But nevertheless, there has been a long history of the interrelationship of that with the collective aggregate kind of behavior. The second paragraph that I extracted, I interpreted very differently, and I'm going to devote the last bit of this short presentation to it, and that is something to do with the role of the individual versus the collective in doing research, and the change that is happening or has been happening in, at least in the fields I'm familiar with, from the role of the individual researcher to the collaborative kind of research team and what that implies. What I'm going to talk about mostly is platitudes and repetition of the kinds of things that have been said. What I tried to do actually was look at the various talks that were on the agenda and try to guess what people were going to say and complement that. And also to be a little bit provocative. So, let's begin here. Let's see. Yes. So first, a statement that says it all about physics from what I consider to be the greatest scientist by far, may I say, that has ever lived, namely Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton introduced this extraordinary idea in the only part of his technical writing, so to speak, the ones that he actually published, where he let his hair down and started to be a little bit philosophical. And he introduced this idea basically of elementary particles of which everything else is built. So here we have this juxtaposition of something that you could think of as an individual constituent versus the aggregate whole. And you can see there he says, now the smallest particles of matter may cohere by the strongest attractions and compose bigger particles of weaker virtue. There are therefore agents in nature able to make particles of bodies stick together by very strong attractions. And then this marvelous last sentence, which is all of what science should be about, and it is the business of experimental philosophy to find them out. So that's what the journey has been for many of us in doing science, is to respond to this in some way. But he set the kind of program which in modern lingo is kind of a reductionistic program, namely that there are individual constituents, and no matter what the system is, if you expand this, and the aggregate is made of those. So we can think of what in the field of physics is that matter is a solid body is made of atoms, that protons are made of quarks, that forests are made of trees, that cities are made of people, that organisms are made up of cells. So that simple idea that there are individual constituents that you lump together to make the whole. And in physics, the idea is that those individual constituents have properties that transcend generally time. That is, these properties are inherent in them, as Newton implies in this, so that an electron is an electron, so to speak. That was the original idea, and that you can build up from these particles, which may have categories of properties, the whole. So that was the idea, and of course this has a long history that goes back through, of course, our Greek forebears, and I will come back to this in a moment. And I'm showing this because this was, of course, part of the philosophical framework that we've inherited, but there was one person that I like to sort out that was different to this, and this is Anaxagoras, who had an opposite view, that in fact everything is made of everything else, that there aren't, so to speak, fundamental individual constituents, but in everything you will find everything else. And there's the hint here, and I wrote it down there, of complexity. There is some hint there that it isn't that you can reduce everything to individual components and add them all back up and get the whole from it. And indeed, I put there in green, this is actually a foreshadow of quantum mechanics, because in quantum mechanics, it's physics. It underlies everything. And in quantum mechanics, ultimately, everything is in some sense made of everything else. And that brings up another view. Now let's see, what have I got here? Ah, yes. But first, what I wanted to do was to write down a bunch of buzzwords that stem from this kind of thinking, beginning with individual versus the collective. Namely, I already mentioned the reductionistic view, bringing everything down to the individual components, versus a more systemic view, which recognizes maybe that there are emergent properties that transcend the properties of the individual components. And this brings up these questions that are really the heart of biology and the social sciences rather than the physical sciences, the question of identity, uniqueness, and diversity. In physics, all electrons are the same, meaning that an electron that I measure and I look at in Santa Fe is the same as it is in New York, as it is in, I just saw Peter Ho there, as it is in Singapore. But it's also the same as what it was at the big, 10 million years ago, or 1 billion years ago, or 10 billion years ago. It's time invariant. When we come to things like economics and biology, of course, we know that an individual in Santa Fe is different than an individual in New York. In fact, at a fine-grained level, each one of us in this room thinks of ourselves as individualistic, that we have our own unique properties, etc. Nevertheless, in constructing a science of human beings, therefore a science of social behavior and a science of economics and a science of our relationship to the natural world, therefore the science of ecology and biology, it is necessary at some scale to say that despite the fact that I can recognize each person here as individual, we are actually at that level like the electrons are all the same, all identical at some level. So I switch immediately to that bottom statement. Individuality is scale dependent. Namely, that if I think of a forest made of a bunch of trees, and I'll pick that example because of the one that Charles just showed of the wonderful work of Carl Nicholas, whom we can talk about that when we discuss, because it's a very interesting example, I think. When I try to make a theory of the forest, of an ecosystem of the forest, to begin with, I might want to consider the individual trees as roughly speaking the same. There may be different species, but a tree of a given size of the same species is pretty much the same, and I'm not going to distinguish them in the same way I'm going to distinguish the individuals in this room. And so, in that sense, the tree is an individual and the forest is an emergent behavior, an emergent many-body system with many of the properties of an aggregate based on these individual invariant subunits. But of course, if I change my resolution and look at the tree as the object, then of course the leaves and the branches and the shape of the bark and all the rest of it starts to come into play, and I start seeing that as no longer identical to the tree next to it, and I start moving down and so forth to multiple levels as I look more and more in terms of the granularity of what I define to be the individual and the fundamental constituent. So any sense of individuality is scale dependent. Okay, so let me skip ahead from this and skip to this, because this is about the individuality of people. Each one of those points actually represents a specific person. There's a name attached to each one of these points. Who are they? And what is this plot? Well, each one of those, well, there are 2, 4, 6 people. 2, 4, 6 people. Each one of those was a world champion weightlifter. I forget the year, but it's actually the 60s. This is an old graph. It's not my graph. And you can see that it was plotted by a biologist because of the way the scales have been done in the axis. It doesn't matter for the purposes of this. Maybe I'll explain it again in a moment. But here's the point. What is plotted here on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, is the logarithm of the maximum, the world record, actually, at this moment, of what that weightlifter could lift. And it's plotted in weird units, and I can just tell you what the real units are from memory. Let's see, is this, oh no, I have to use this to point. But the top one, let's see, this one. This man here, what these numbers mean, this is the weight of the weightlifter. So he's the heavyweight, 198 pounds. And he lifts 10 cubed, it turns out, about 1,000 pounds. That's not individual, just so you know, this is tangential to this. This is actually 3 different kinds of weights that you lift. You know, you bench press, whatever you do. You know what I mean. Anyway, it's the total of those. And down here is the lightweight. He weighs 123 pounds. And I think this number corresponds to about 790 pounds from memory. That may be slightly wrong. But here's the point. 2 points here. This line represents a prediction from a very simple theory that was first enunciated by the first great modern scientist, Galileo. Galileo realized something extraordinary that was kind of obvious in retrospect, and that is that the amount that you can lift scales non-linearly with your size. So that if you double your size, if you double the size of an animal, you don't double its strength, and it can't lift twice as much. And as he pointed out, a horse cannot lift even its own weight, whereas a dog can lift 3 or 4 times its own weight. And the rule becomes about, this is just parenthetic to the discussion, comes about because strength of a limb, an arm, the beam holding up this building, it depends only on the cross-sectional area of the beam. Okay, and that goes like a length squared. It's an area, so it goes like a length squared, but it has to hold up, you know, well, in this case, these 2 things have to hold up the rest of my body, and when and the size of my body, namely its volume and therefore its weight, scales like a length cubed, and it scales much faster. So if you keep getting bigger, gravity wins, and the length cubed always beats a length squared. Okay, so that's what this rule is, and that's why someone, not me, put on this graph 2 to 3. The 2 represents the squared going upwards, and the 3 represents the cube going horizontally. So that's how you can derive this, and Galileo already realized this. And here's what's interesting, is that each one of these individuals, with their own individual lives, own individual histories, training each in their own individual ways to the best extent, have all lined up where they should be on this graph. It's amazing, actually. They lift exactly, in quotes, what they should be lifting for the size that they are. So there is, at one sense, here we have the intersection of individuality with something that transcends individuality, that is the collective of what human beings are. Namely, if you are a human being, roughly speaking, you will be able to lift a certain amount. That's what it is. We'll come back to that in a minute. Now we want to get a little more to the individuality in this, because if you notice, incidentally, almost all of these are Russians or Bulgarians. This man, this man, this man, and this man, 4 of them, do exactly what they should be doing. But you notice that the middleweight is a little bit above, just a little bit above, and the heavyweight is a little bit below. So, if we are a physicist, we say, if you ask the question, who is the strongest man in the world? If you're not a physicist, and you're my mum, you would say the heavyweight, the 198 pound, obviously, because he lifts 1,000 pounds, obviously the strongest man. From a physicist's viewpoint, you say no, because he should have lifted, I'll make up some numbers, 1,020 pounds, but in fact, he only lifted 998 pounds. So he underperformed, whereas this guy here is slightly above, should have lifted, I'll make up a number, 870 pounds. He actually lifted 910. But all these other guys did what they should. Who is the strongest man in the world? This man. Okay? That is, there's a baseline about which we can make an informed scientific judgment. Now, of course, these are well-trained and so on and so forth. If we could do it for everybody in this room, and of course then we start to see all the individual variations that actually reflect much more your individual history. The fact that I do not believe, I'm the last person of my generation that does not believe in it. Where's our doctor friend? Do not believe in exercise. I hate it, I don't do it, and maybe I will suffer long term. So if I try to lift, compared to Fred, who does work out, he will beat me relative to his size. So there'll be some fluctuations, and it is those fluctuations that represent the individuality. Okay, so let me continue. So as I say, this is very much, as I hope I said this is barely even at the high school level. Okay, so let's move on. So look at these beasts. They're all mammals, and they look very different. And if you were a shrew, and I showed you several pictures of shrews, each one would look different to you. Okay? There'd be individuals harping on the same theme, same with elephants and whales and so on. But, nevertheless, all of these are us. We're just one of these. And so there's kind of also this sense that even though there's an individual within shrewdom, there's a generic thing that is a collective called shrew, similarly with elephants and whales. But there's also something, now taking this idea of scale, of being a mammal. We're one of these, meaning that in some resolution, we're all basically the same. And I hate to harp on it, but this says it. The scaling law for something like metabolic rate. And what you see is, if you plot metabolic rate on a log scale versus body mass in the same way we did. So this is this Byzantine way of plotting it, where you got by factors of 10 in both directions. If you plot it this way, you find that everybody lines up on this graph with some little bits of variation, just like those weightlifters. But, you know, this says two things. First, there's something extraordinary about this, because each one of these organisms, as we have heard this morning and we heard just earlier, each one of these, each subsystem of one of these, each organ, each cell type, each gene has its own unique, historically contingent evolutionary track. And yet, nevertheless, all of these have lined up, roughly speaking, on the same graph, indicating, now I'm going to make a cartoon out of it. Oh, I should add one other thing. If you look at any other physiological variable or life history event, it looks like this. Similar kind of behavior. It does not show the randomness that you implicitly assume, naively maybe, that natural selection says that they'd be all over the map. They somehow line up as if there are mechanical rules underlying it, indicating in the cartoon version that there's one mammal. There's only one mammal, that's the individual, and all of us are some tiny variation around that mammal, suitably scaled according to rules given by these laws. That's what it says. There's one mammal. So there's this, at a big enough scale, that's the individual. That acts as the individual. So this is continuing with that theme. Okay. So I won't belabor the point. This is growth. I'm going to miss out these. This is showing that growth continues in the same way. I did show this for a reason. Now I remember. Yes. So this is showing, if you plot things in the right way, everybody grows in the same way. And I did it for the following reason. Here's one of the best examples, and we already saw it this morning. The ant, as the fundamental particle of an ant colony. And this is not as a dramatic example as the one Doug showed. But here's what's interesting. Here's a graph of that same growth curve, but what is put on it is both the individual insects the individuals and the colony as a superorganism. And you can see, despite the fact there is these fluctuations indicating the history, that there is this idea that if you look again at a coarse enough resolution, indeed the ant colony acts as if it is a single ant. So we have this, okay. Now, here's a graph that shows another aspect of this, which is, and what is plotted here is the metabolic rate of cells versus their size. And what is plotted is the following. The blue line, which decreases, is cells in vivo. That is, this is the measurement of the metabolic rate of cells in the body of various animals, ranging from, again, roughly the shrew to the elephant, actually. And what is plotted is, in contrast, is if you take those cells, a liver cell from a mouse, a liver cell from a human being, a liver cell from an elephant, and you grow them in a petri dish in vitro, they all line up in the same way. Okay? So therefore it says something else about individuality. Your individuality depends upon your environment. If you are part of the team that is keeping alive whatever the organism is, you behave differently than if you're a free man, basically is what this says, in a systematic way with, again, this individual variation. Okay, let me move on quickly. I will miss this out. Cities I will miss out too, to tell you the same thing, because I want to get to another part of this. It's the same thing, and I just showed data and universe. I'm going to miss. So I want to move on to the last part of the subject of this, which is a little bit different. So here's the group of my collaborators, all kind of vaguely associated with SFI, that worked on the biology, and this is the group that worked on the city stuff. So that's a big group. And they're all individuals. These are individuals. We know, many of you know them. And of course, if you look at this, they play different roles. So again, we have the collective, we have the collaboration, which is a collective, which did the work, but we have different roles and different stages of career and so on. So this one has, the ones in red are the ones that have been very active, and you'll hear Luis tomorrow, have been very active, and the ones down the bottom. So it's kind of interesting, this, just as a side editorial comment, these are the young guys at the top who did all the work and made all the progress. The ones at the bottom, which could include me, are the ones that are well established and did bugger all. So, but anyway, there they are. But we are, in some sense, a collaboration, okay, a group. So I want to talk about that a little bit in the last part. And I want to introduce you to someone that's had as big an effect on your life as any human being that has existed. J.J. Thomson. Because I started to think, when I thought about individual versus the collective, the role of some individuals in what's happened in the historical evolution of the universe. The electron would have been discovered anyway. J.J. Thomson is the man that discovered the electron in 1897. An extraordinary achievement, because he realized it by looking at cathode rays, and this is kind of a facsimile, it's a weird one, of the paper, and down there is a picture of J.J. in his lab in Cambridge. And I also want to point out something else that's in the text. If you can't read it, you can't read it, I'll read it to you. It says, he was head of the Cavendish in Cambridge and began to admit postgraduate students who had not been Cambridge undergraduates. You couldn't become a graduate student unless you'd already been an undergraduate. And he changed this, and he was the person that should be credited with the whole structure we have now of getting students to come and work with you and train them as a group. And indeed, it says the influx of young physicists from around the world contributed greatly to the vitality of the experimental activities that Thomson supervised. Another point, which is totally tangential to this, but I couldn't resist putting it up. This is a quote from J.J. At first, there were very few who believed in the existence of these bodies smaller than atoms. Electrons. The whole of our society operates because of understanding electrons. That's what we are, in a way, in terms of our infrastructure, especially IT and so on. It was rejected by most. In fact, he has this little anecdote. I was even told long afterwards by a distinguished physicist who had been present at my lecture at the Royal Institution that he thought I'd been pulling their legs. I did also, parenthetically, in terms of the individual and the collective, put down a list of some of his students that worked him as a student. J.J. Thomson was an extraordinary educator. He also not only discovered electrons, he invented the idea and discovered isotopes. These are students of his. He had 7 Nobel Prize winners as students, and some of those that were not might as well have been. G.I. Taylor at the bottom was one of the great theoretical physicists of the 20th century on hydrodynamics. And he actually had an 8th, which is the one at the bottom, the man that discovered that electrons are not just particles, they're waves, and that was his son. Son also got the Nobel Prize. So this is someone most people don't know about, but is a remarkable man. Individual. So let me move on from that. So that's the way, that's the heritage we have in science. Now, I want to skip ahead in this field of discovery, and I'm going to use the field I know best. And you'll excuse these were, I went back over some old stuff I had, and these were on transparencies, which I would much prefer to have used. But can you believe it, Board of Trustees? We no longer have an overhead projector. And I think I'm ready to resign unless we go and buy one. So I had to get these bloody things on this idiot PowerPoint kind of stuff. Anyway, so there's JJ, the single author, the individual, beginning to form groups. He was one of the first, beginning to form collaborations, and great things came out of it, all our early modern structure of the atom and the precursor of quantum mechanics. So we jump ahead. This is about 1960, and I brought this up here because the first great thing that our wonderful colleague Murray did in high-energy physics, where is it? Murray, wake up a moment, was the suggestion of strangeness. And this was one of the experiments looking for strange particles at the Brookhaven lab. I could not find the original one that got it, but this was it. And the point I want to make is that it's already, you see, it's a collaboration of 2, 4, 6, 7 people, okay, in this field of looking for the fundamental constituents and the interactions. Jump ahead 20 years. This is actually the experiment, or part of a series of experiments that discovered the quark, something that maybe the 5th great thing that Murray did, suggesting quarks, and this was the experiment. And I don't know, there's about 14 or 15 of them there. It was a collaboration between SMAC at Stanford and MIT, and this is about 1970. And here's looking for a flavor of quarks. So we have, like genes, there are many flavors of genes. There are flavors of quarks. And this was looking at something called the top quark. And I don't know, there's probably 100 people and 20 institutions involved in this. So this is from the individual to the collaborative, the collective. Jump ahead to CERN, 1990 again, around there. So this, you don't have to understand what this is, but it's called the Aleph collaboration. And this just is, it's kind of ridiculous. It just continually goes on. And now we jump ahead to, some of you may remember the superconducting super collider. This is just the number of institutions involved. Okay? Collective. And here's some of the people that are actually involved, and so forth. Oh, I found that. I thought that was amusing. There's nothing to do with anything. Well, I thought it was a good reminder. I found it in my old stuff. That's how I often feel. But the point is, there's been this extraordinary evolution. And in fact, if you looked in I meant to bring it on the September 11th, I think it is, issue of Science, there is an article about the closing down of the Tevatron, which is the biggest accelerator in the United States, the second biggest in the world, closed down recently, and it was a review of it. And one of the things it pointed out was that one of the problems it faced was, even if they discovered the top quark, actually, even if it got a Nobel Prize, even if it was deemed worthy, which it is in many ways, who would you give it to? Because there's 1,500 people. And not only that, so normally what has been done in the past, because the Nobel Prize has been given based on the idea of the individual. It's the individuals, the J.J. Thomsons of the world, the Murray Gell-Manns. But science has completely changed. It's now collective, collaborative, big time, and so on. Who do you give this Nobel Prize to? And so there was an interesting discussion in Science of last month. And I looked up the big collaboration, the Atlas collaboration at the LHC, and it has now over 3,000 physicists in the collaboration. And if you go to the web page is bigger, so to speak, more extensive than the Santa Fe Institute webpage, of course, because there's 3,000 people. But do you know, you cannot find, on that, at least I could not find, a list of everybody. It's just the institutions. It's absolutely extraordinary. So it's kind of interesting what's been happening. This is a huge issue for science because of the beginning more and more the domination of big data sets and the hegemony of computation and simulation and so on. This is huge now, and I think we have to kind of face many of these social issues that are involved. Lastly, I want to talk about, this is very quick, politics, because this country resurrected something that had been dead for 2,000 years. 200 years ago, we resurrected something that was dead 2,000 years ago, or more than 2,000 years earlier, and was considered not only unworkable, but dangerous, namely the idea of democracy. And here's this statement from the Constitution. And I must say, in thinking about this, I find this extraordinary, this statement, because it is not self-evident at all. At all, I would say. It's not self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed with certain innate. I think that's totally, because what it says is we're all equal. In fact, you don't see the difference between us in terms of the political right. That's what it says. We're all equal. Ironically, the only systems that have been in modern era that have tried to do that are the Soviet Union and Communist China. Made everybody equal. And here it is, kind of right up front in our Constitution, and whereas this famous statement from Karl Marx recognizes the difference between individuals, that we are different, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Unfortunately, it was made by Karl Marx, and we've had 100 years of terrible history associated with it, which is too bad, because in many ways we should really take this to heart in some way to counteract what has been happening in terms of some of the developments in society, in terms of the relationship between the individual and a naive sense of democracy and the collective. And so I'll leave it with that, but I wanted to add one thing that was particularly controversial because it follows in a way. And incidentally, it is no accident, I believe, that this statement came at the end of the 18th century, which began roughly with the acceptance of the Newtonian idea that there are underlying equal constituents giving rise to the functioning of the whole. This is not an accident. This is somehow Newton, in some weird way, reaching out to in the Weltanschauung of the founders of the country. Okay, I'll finish, and I went on too long as usual. So, Charles.
So I take it from what you said, Geoffrey, that a physicist used to be able to do science on their own 100 years ago, and now it takes an increasing number of physicists to do the same amount of work. So there's been a steady decline in the quality of physicists.
No, I think that's a rather biological and stupid way of...
Well, I thought that was sort of what you said, though.
No, it's that the problems, of course, I mean, there's many interpretations of that, and that could be one of them, of course. But more likely it is that much of the physics could be thought of that has been done until maybe the beginning of the century, partly was more low-hanging fruit, possibly. There are all kinds of social reasons as well. But in terms of the field I described here, we have the problem that in order to do those experiments, in order to get the enormous energies to have a microscope that can look down at microscopic distances, we have to have huge machines, and that requires big collaborations to build detectors. But I will add to it, which is relevant to what you're saying, and that is that the interesting thing is that I think it's true, and Luis probably knows this much better than I because he's worked on some of these things, is that the size of collaborations in theory, which are not driven by that so much, have also grown significantly.
But does it actually mean that there's not a place anymore for the individual physicist with a couple of postdocs and students?
No, I don't think that's necessarily true. It's just simply that's the trend. And I would say the other aspect is the nature of the problem in terms of, first of all, the data that comes, are often large data sets, the kinds of problems that physicists are now moving into in terms of looking at nanoscales, and it's questions of things like soft condensed matter, that is, its interface with biology, and requires broader thinking. Maybe it requires more technical calculations, more simulations, and so on. And the expertise coming together does require collaboration more than it did even 30 years ago.
But there are still problems that individuals can...
Oh yes, no, I'm not saying there aren't, but they're becoming the style. So one of the questions I don't know the answer to, whether because of that a certain culture and style is built up now, that collaboration is somehow socially rewarded greater than individual. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I just wanted to follow up with a couple of questions from the last part of your talk. But Charles, do you have any thoughts about Jeff's?
There's some observations. One of them, which is relevant to this one, is that I believe there was a paper published in Nature recently with 35,000 authors. Anybody know this one? It's not really authors. It's just a protein folding problem.
Oh, yes, I did say, yeah.
And so someone put it out on the web with an application where you could just sort of grab. And I think what had happened is that the jumping rules that the physicists were using were enormously restrictive. So they constantly got stuck in local maximum, minimum, whatever you want to view it. The people who were making the big advances in the folding were often like furniture designers. The people have got tremendous spatial skills, but also because the software enabled them to reach in and just say, that bit looks like that bit, so I'm going to unzip this, unzip that, and put those next to each other. They were able to search the space in a way that was sort of chaotic. But 35,000 people participated, and you got a score if you got the next lowest Gibbs free energy out of it. So that's an extreme.
But I think that's a very important point. But one thing I didn't mention, but is obviously driving this, is the fact that the connectivity between people has increased phenomenally. So you don't have to be in the same place and at the same time.
And the problem could be specified in such a way that they could all interact.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's like having 35,000 people build a canal, in a sense.
Yeah.
So I was going to, this issue of individuality, I take minor issue with the idea of individuality being a matter of scale. I don't know whether it's just semantics on my part. But it seems to me with the mammalian metabolism, it's really not a matter of scale as much the narrowness of the telescope through which you view the world.
That's what I meant by scale.
Okay.
That's what I meant. I meant the resolution with which you look.
So the resolution is highly restrictive. I am just going to look at metabolism. Then a mammal turns out to be a mammal. And not a
No,
lizard.
I was thinking, but let's see. The resolution there is I'm looking at a big enough resolution that that encompasses all mammals, okay, as a scale. I don't see, individual deviations, and I don't see, the fact that it's made of, it has a certain genomic structure, it has certain organs, and so on. All those are kind of lost in the.
Yeah, so to me, the crucial thing, there's that one component, which is obviously get the graph. You need scale for graph.
Of course.
But the second one is you need to really limit the window within which you look at the world, which is I'm going to simply measure metabolism.
Yeah, but I said you could look at any physiological variable.
Yeah, right.
It would have the same kind of behavior, heart rate, rate of diffusion of oxygen across a membrane.
So that leads me to the second point, which is interesting, which is the emphasis on the individual in terms of thinking of electrons. And I think to me, Darwin really, and I should have said it in my bit, fundamentally said that evolution, things change because of differences in individuals.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
I meant to say that when yes. And that's why I had that thing, I forget what I said, unique, something, diversity, because it was exactly that. I meant to actually say that. Of course, even though we consider all humans the same or rats the same at some scale, of course, it's those individual differences that are, in a certain sense, that diversity in the population that can lead to...
that does lead to...
That does lead, in fact, of course, to evolutionary change.
Which means the entities, i.e. the electrons, are...
But the electrons don't.
Right, so you've got this funny... So to me, the funny world of biology is that... So for something like electrons or protons, they're time invariant, there are bazillions of them, and they operate by very, very simple rules.
Yes, but having said that, I kind of glossed over it, but, an electron... What you say an electron is also scale dependent. Namely that, the level we normally think of, it's just a little point particle that's traveling along. But if you look at a higher resolution, you have, because of quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle, for that period in which you're looking, it could have thrown out a couple of virtual photons. So actually what you see, I'll make a cartoon of it, really is an electron and a few photons. And then you look at a finer scale, you see more and more, and so on. So, and that gets to the idea that inside everything is everything else. Because if you look at, that's the, if you take that to the extreme, you could see everything inside that electron if you had a fine enough resolution.
Like delta T small enough,
yes,
delta
exactly.
E can do
delta
anything.
E can be anything.
Yeah, right.
That's the idea. So.
Did you want to continue on that?
Well, I just wanted to just... before he derailed me, which is very clever.
Sorry,
nicely done. So to me, when I think of biology in a physical science sense, so I have, rather than 10 to the 23 particles, I've got, 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 of them, and they're all different from each other, and they're distributed in a clumpy way in space with respect to fitness. So they might not be clumpy with respect to metabolism, but they are, with respect to fitness.
Absolutely.
And so it means that sort of statistical approach becomes almost impossible because the particulars of the interaction start to make a difference.
If you want to see the time evolution of that.
If you want to see the time evolution.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So that means that that's presumably why, in terms of evolutionary theory, and it goes to a point that you brought up, I think, is that it seems to me, and I may be wrong in this, that it's hard to imagine that one would have a theoretical framework that you could, I'll use the word quantitatively, predict the spectrum of animals. It goes to, Gould's point as well, of course, that a priori, you cannot predict that because it is this sequence of events and variations.
So what I didn't say, and I forgot to, for the plant computer simulation, those 20-odd morphologies basically appear by the end of the Devonian and capture the gross morphological form of all plants. So there's a case with 6 developmental rules and 4 selective pressures. You do actually mimic the gross plant evolution with high fidelity.
Yeah. But I do agree with what I think you implied, even if you didn't say, that in a lot of this, genes play a subdominant role. That there's a bunch of other rules. I mean, of course, natural selection plays a role because of selection pressures. But, it's not clear that the genes, other than saying I'm a tree or I'm a branch and so on. It isn't that it's somehow the genes that are changing and doing it. There's this kind of externality of the physical universe.
Well, it's that the genes are combinatorial in the way they operate.
Sure.
That's the key aspect of it. And so it's the combinatorial potential of the genes. And then it depends very much on what the selective pressures are. And so it's a dance between the two of them. But so I would argue then that if you extrapolate the Carl Nicholas plant evolution to animal evolution, maybe it is actually repeatable in some sense. But we haven't got the wit to see it yet because we get addicted by the individual differences of sea urchin versus jellyfish versus fish.
So that brings me we may be going off track a little bit here from the individual versus the collective. But I spent a lot of time with Carl, actually, because that work is very much related to the work underlying that metabolic rate and this other scaling. And so I could have put him almost as a collaborator. I didn't write a paper with him, but several of those my colleagues there have written lots of papers with him. So it's kind of could have been put on there as a collaborator of in this group sense. And there the idea is that those kinds of pictures that he drew, which are kind of networks, those networks have their own mathematics and physics that transcend the individual, not only the individuality within a species, but transcend species. So that it goes very much to I think, to the point you were trying to make, showing that there's the way I see it, this fantastic interplay between I'll use the word optimization, which I know people don't like to use in this, but the optimization of networks and the interface between that, the given genetic components and combinatorics, as you say, at that time in history, and of course, the external environment.
Yeah, so the staggering thing for me is he's got a theoretical morphospace, and he can assign fitnesses.
Right, exactly.
So he can do the Darwinian two-step variation followed by selection.
That's right.
And he gets a very, very powerful result out of it. So it really makes me wonder if we could do the same thing for other systems, we might find the same sort of order just falling out quite quickly in front of us, including for animals and everything else. Yeah. And what bothers me with the argument, my counter to that, so my claim would be that once you start getting predation evolved on the seafloor, that in order 10 million years, evolution with point mutation, gene conversion, recombination, insertion, deletion can solve the NP-hard problem of finding those animal optimal peaks. So when you see the evolution of jawed fish, it takes in order of a period the Devonian. You see the radiation of mammals when the dinosaurs go extinct, it's in the order of a period. So it looks like evolution takes in order 10 million years to solve that problem. But if I'm sitting now at the Cambrian explosion, would I even think of URLs? And I don't think so, right? No, I can't smell that coming yet.
But I think that's the real problem with this, and I can see why Gould got into this, into this corner, that, in a certain sense, once you've told me, once you start the process, it's arbitrary what actually happens. Now, but there are I don't agree with that, actually. I do agree, of course, it wouldn't look like this, but I do believe that there are these underlying principles that in fact to do with networks is one example, that are always operant. And so, may not end up looking like this in detail, but generically it will be pretty much the same if, given that the conditions, the external conditions allow it, of course.
Yeah, right.
So let me ask a question of the two of you. In your talk, Charles, you seem to be arguing that in the tension between the idiographic and the nomothetic, the way to make progress was really on the nomothetic end of the scale, which I think Geoffrey would agree with. So does science only encompass the nomothetic? Is there no role for idiographic within science? So in other words, going back to what I said this morning, can we only do science on things that have properties of a class and not on things that have properties of individuals?
So that's a different question.
There are two related questions.
Yeah, I mean, I tend not to view it as in principle, but as how to make progress. So we have, the origin of the universe, we have the origin of the sun, the origin of life, with the unfolding of life with the evolution of complexity of various kinds, the sort of things that you were talking about, the evolution of humans, those are empirical things that we want to know about. And so the way I like to view the question is, what is the extent to which, how compact can we make the explanation? So those data are fundamental and we can't do without them. In fact, they define the problem for us. So then the question is, how compact can we make it? And so if we can do it deeply nomothetically, we can make it very, very compact. We say, here are the dynamics, here are the sort of the variables and the boundary conditions, and just let it run and it will unfold. Or is it going to be hard to make compact? Because contingency and chance events constantly reshape the rules of interaction and the boundary conditions that you finish up having to plug in lots of information every time with those ones. So I kind of view it in terms of the extent to which we can make it compact, compressible. That's the way I view it. But without the facts, we've got nothing to explain. So in that sense, the raw empirical data are our bread and butter.
So in a couple of years ago, we had the meeting that David Krakauer organized on laws of history. But in trying to do that, in a sense, you would argue that it's only by identifying the trends that allow us to compact history that we could make, in a sense, in fact, Geoffrey was one of the participants of that meeting, that we could make progress towards that goal of defining laws of history.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like, if I drop my pen, we pretty much know what's going to happen, plus or minus. Though it will be interesting whether it'll stay on the little platform here or go onto the floor, so there's some ambiguity there. We know what's going to happen roughly an hour from now. We can say what's going to happen tomorrow. 3 weeks from now, for each of us, that history gets a little more uncertain, right? So I always view it in terms of waiting times as to how much does my knowledge of now and all the dynamics and how much do I need about the history to understand what's going to happen, projecting into the future different time periods. And human history, that strikes me as being really, really hard.
Clearly it's, on the one hand, and the way it's been interpreted is that it is, we use the word historically contingent, meaning that it's a whole bunch of accidents in a way. But, you could think through, and people do, I suppose, would the United States actually be very different if George Washington had not lived, for example? I don't know. Obviously it's not an answerable question, but it may be, it sets a kind of a...
Counterfactuals.
Yeah, kind of counterfactuals,
yeah,
right. And I think that's that's again, I would say, a scale problem, because obviously, if you look over what you were saying, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, no George Washington might have a huge effect. But, in the end, America was going to dominate the world, kind of thing. That was somehow over a certain period. I'm just throwing that out as, an idea. So there might be things.
I think so. I agree.
Coarse-grained, they're kind of inevitable. That even without Napoleon, Europe would look pretty much the way it does, kind of thing.
So to me, I always start, what is the grain?
Yeah, and that's a very hard one.
If the grain could be terrible, individual events at individual microseconds for individuals, and that's hopeless.
Sure.
Or it could be quite coarse, which for a couple of decades it works quite fine at the level of nations.
Right.
So the question is, what is the graininess of it? Is the way to address the question.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience now.
I would have thought, too, just as interjection, that, I saw this as a way of actually starting to generate discussion within, so I don't see things necessarily have to go through the platform. Just my prejudice.
Questions? Raise your hands for the microphone. It's coming.
So two quick things. One is, where does the 10 million year figure come from?
That's just the empirical reading of the fossil record.
Oh, okay. That's not something you derived.
No, I don't know how to derive that. Okay. Yeah, it scares the hell out of yeah.
So, but in what you were just talking about, no George Washington, what about no Hitler, no Jesus Christ?
Yeah, right.
Exactly. That's the question.
Right. It's a question. No Watson and Crick.
Maybe those are easier. Those are much easier.
Yeah, right.
I said it actually when I showed Thomson.
Precisely.
Right.
Someone said, obviously, the electron would have been discovered.
But were there individuals, what about no Einstein?
Yeah, it would have been discovered.
But it would have taken longer, right? So what else changes? No?
That's
Okay.
right.
His wife would have figured it out.
Right.
So what about Newton? So
Bessel would have figured it. that is acknowledged, in the original paper.
So with my Cambrian explosion argument, I find myself running the argument, if the process had happened, say, 500 million years earlier, the protogenome would have had a different structure to it. What then would have been the engineering potential within that genome? So that's the way I try to do the counterfactual argument in that sense.
Other questions?
No, we failed miserably.
It's probably not a question. It's just amusing as I was looking at your two quotes, Geoffrey, and thinking about the irony of what one says and then what it becomes, and whether that's even sort of predictable. But I really appreciate both of you. I'm thinking the British Empire is still alive and well, if we look at who the speakers are on the stage, judging by your accents at least.
Well, some of us take offence at that. So, so following last night, I'd say, "G'day, mate." And to the next question, I've only travelled from California. There's Brian. So.
Where were you from originally, Peter? Charles, where are you from?
Australian.
You're Australian.
Yeah,
okay,
so it is
well,
British Empire, but we don't like to be reminded of it.
well, maybe we are still three countries separated by a common language, but I very much appreciated what you both had to say, and Doug, you for putting this whole thing together. I was thinking about your choosing to quote from Isaac Newton and sort of natural philosophy burgeoning into philosophy, and your notion that, was there something about what he said in 1680 that was then the precursor going forward for all these other things, Geoffrey? And I was thinking about the question of, does the individual matter? As a psychologist, if I don't believe that that is of consummate value, well, I couldn't go to work, for one thing, and I don't know how you get to value in the aggregate if you don't start with value in the individual. So I'm just shifting it over a little bit from the biology and the science to more the philosophical, psychological. And I was thinking that when I die, they won't bury you or burn you. When I die as an individual, this universe of lived experience, as far as I can tell, shifts or comes to an end, or I believe comes to an end. And I was thinking about, it's our experience, everything that we experience comes through our individuality, through us as an individual, through consciousness and mind and body and everything else. So I was thinking that in some ways all there really is the individual. And whatever we may be in some, it starts with the individuality of experience and perception. That's about it.
Well, I think that's true. I think that's manifest. We're inside our own heads, and we have this problem to begin with, that we can only remember the past and we can't remember the future. And that seems to be, wired in to the fabric of the universe. And that's a huge issue. But given who we are, and this is an evolutionary question, where in the hell did that come from, that we somehow are creatures that not only contemplate about ourselves, but are interested in finding order out there. Looking for order in the universe and making some kind of sense of it. And, I don't know when that began, but obviously, well, not obviously, I should backtrack on that, but possibly that's where religion comes from, looking for some kind of order and some kind of meaning, and we've done that. And science, I think, is, something that what has happened in the last couple of hundred years is truly extraordinary, I think, because we've somehow blossomed from, and I would put it to Galileo and Newton, to a very different way of trying to find order, maybe even impose order. It's a philosophical question on, the enormous amount of sense data that we receive. And out of that has come pretty much all of modern science, with all its very different manifestations, from, the one extreme of social sciences and biology to the other extreme of mathematical physics. But it does start with the individual, but it also is that funny thing that we want to understand and we want to talk to one another. This is amazing to me. This is something, and it would be wonderful, going back to your question, it would be is it conceivable that we will understand evolutionary theory at some stage where we understand where this piece came from?
Yeah, I mean,
which I think you brought up
yeah,
in your...
it's nascently conceivable. But I would say, but we're so deeply social, right? So that's the dilemma of our species, is that we experience ourselves in some sense as individuals. I am. But we're also enormously social and connected. Yeah. And we produce social things like buildings, orchestras, sports events, SFIs. SFI. There aren't any parallel universes?
There's only one of us, Charles.
Yeah, out there.
Geoffrey and Charles, of those occasions in science in which we've felt the need to ignore the individual or at least downplay the individual, what fraction of those would you estimate are cases in which we really can't study the individual adequately for one reason or another, either for Heisenberg uncertainty reasons at one end, or in the human sciences, there's just too damn much stuff going on, and we can't understand it anyway. Is it a principled move toward the aggregate, or are we somehow being forced by the nature of the juxtaposition of the scientific enterprise with the kind of variability that we really see in the universe?
That's a really good question. The first thing that pops into my mind is when I first learnt about renormalization. And renormalization struck me as being basically a device to get around our own finiteness. So there's a case where that advance seems to be simply a case of having to do some way of finding a trick to get around our finiteness. But that, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure I quite understood your question, and stop me as I ramble on trying to answer it.
Okay.
Stop. Good.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that there's, in my little, diatribe earlier about Newton and the fundamental constituents and building up the whole from the underlying structure. Of course, and he actually says it there. I mean, the physics, for example, has only succeeded really where there's a relatively clean boundary between different levels of organization. And I think the problem, one of the major problems we have in biology and the social sciences is it's not clear where those boundaries, the boundaries are very gray. And also the interaction between the constituents are very strong. And those two things are actually interrelated. And that's a huge issue, the question of strongly interacting systems, whatever they be, and this whole question of separation of levels. And I'm not sure that's what you were asking about.
But following on, that means, I agree with this, that means then that the levels at which the interacting objects operate on is the level which you have to focus at least some of your attention. And therefore, by definition, is a natural place rather than simply driven to it because we can't handle...
But I think part of that, I was going to just add one last thing that is, I think you might have been getting at, is that, if you think about trying to understand an individual human being, one of the ways science has worked well, taking this idea of levels, is that if you can abstract a piece, so it is part of the reductionistic view, but you can say, well, I can consider this piece of it, and try to isolate that as if it's disconnected from everything else. And I suppose the complex systems view is that you can't do that, and indeed you can't, of course. And the great struggle is to find techniques and ways of dealing with these strongly interacting, highly complex systems where you can't make this separation. I mean, we had the talk on medicine, and medicine, of course, operates mostly in that mode, that you can deal with, if you have a heart problem, you deal with the heart. I mean, the very fact you say it's a heart problem, and someone, yes, you brought up Chinese medicine. which I don't know very much about, other than that it tends to be much more holistic and systemic. And, because for historical reasons, but also because there was a body of people who felt that the problems were actually highly interrelated, and you've got to look at multiple things all at once. So I'm not sure if that is...
I want to get back to the cities work for a moment, because you were talking about the importance of discrete levels as being critical to analysis. But there's a large literature in sociology on neighborhoods. Have you and Luis and your colleagues focused on cities because they're more discrete analytical objects than, say, whereas a neighborhood within cities have those mushy boundaries that are more difficult for the sort of analysis that you guys are conducting?
And the short answer is yes, in the following sense, that even defining a city is problematic, but, I won't go into that, but there are people that have tried very hard and just to varying degrees succeeded in defining an entity that you could call a city, and so that you have a common definition that you can compare cities. And, the work that we've been involved in was looking for regularities with those entities. Fair enough. And that means that's going back to our original early conversation, that's doing a very coarse-grained averaging. And now you can ask the question, can we disaggregate the city, deconstruct it into, just make up some words, downtown and suburbs and so forth. And, of course, one would like to do that, and indeed, I think that becomes much more problematic because, and Luis can correct me here and tell me, you probably know more than I do, that I don't think that there is a operational definition really for a downtown or a suburb. That is common, that you can use common across, say, all of the United States. That would be fantastic because you could then do this whole question of looking at the heterogeneity within cities, and it's doing this whole process of taking your microscope and turning up the resolution. But it is this problem that you have. We recognize that there are these multiple levels, but making an operational definition that you can quantify and do science is tremendously problematic, and that crosses much of the social sciences.
Other questions?
I think the notion of boundaries that you bring up is a really important one. When you had your graph up of the weightlifters and the weight that they can lift, it struck me that that's really a story about an asymptote.
Yes, it is an asymptote. I didn't want to bring that. It is. It's an asymptotic because I kind of intimated it by saying, these are the world champs. They train, so they represent the boundary value for all of us of a given weight. Yeah. That's what that curve represents. I didn't want to go to that, but that's what it is.
Yeah. And we're there right now in the Tour de France, I think, too, which is
exactly. So any of the professional athletes are boundary values.
Right. But and so what that made me think was that there are some areas of inquiry that are in a place right now in their development where we don't know the boundaries yet. And one of those that struck me is neuroscience, which is the field that I trained in. And it strikes me in the last few decades how much we have learned from the abnormal individual. And in fact, until sometime around 1990, we didn't really have great ways of looking into the heads of normal individuals, right? We didn't have brain imaging techniques. So we were stuck with the person who had a stroke in this part of the brain, the person who was shot in the head, the person who had a treatment for epilepsy that destroyed part of their brain. That kind of inquiry helps us map out the boundaries of what this particular biological system can do. But where we are now in that field is a really interesting place because we realize now that we need also to investigate boundaries by looking at scale invariant neural systems. What are small systems of nerve cells or entities that behave like nerve cells capable of? What are large systems capable of? But in that particular field, we're still at a place where we need both types of inquiry. Yeah. But I'm guessing that maybe in your two fields, you're at different developmental stages, and one mode of inquiry might be a bit more important than the other. Do you want to comment on that?
I would say in evolutionary biology, ecology, we're not too different from that. We've got some scale invariants that are being found, so Jim Brown and colleagues with the sort of the macroecological, but we don't know how to manipulate systems. We don't know even what their stable states are because we can't observe them for long enough. We don't know what stability means. We don't know what the species composition is. We don't know how they interact with each other. How important is the level of interaction? Can we treat them as particles? So I think we're further along, but I think we still don't really see a clear way forward in those areas, which is one of the reasons why I love it, because I love these muddy how do you make progress type disciplines.
Well, yes, no, I don't know. I can't really comment on where it is relative to that, but I do. But the point that you're bringing up is one that I don't think I articulated very well, which is that, indeed, looking at abnormal cases, outliers, is incredibly important. But it's particularly important, though, that you have the right baseline. What is an outlier with respect to, to what? And I thought that the talk this morning, our doctor friend, was really medicine, coming to terms with, are there quantifiable baselines that we can use to talk about, the average idealized individual? That's what those numbers mean. And they come from no theory. They come from purely, statistical inference from enormous amounts of data. And the faith in that is that there is such a thing as a normal, the baseline. There is a baseline. One thing he didn't show us, and is to show, what the variance is, and so on. That it came up in the discussion. People asked about that. What are they? And you need that in order for each one of us, on the one hand, just in terms of our own health, to know where do we stand, and how important is that variance. There's a whole bunch of, obviously, secondary questions. And then there are the questions that you raise as science, that in each of these cases, that baseline should be used for looking at outliers to learn something. Why is it that, for example, you could imagine, and this is total bullshit probably because I don't know anything about it, but you could imagine that someone has all these weird numbers relative to these things that operates extraordinarily well and lives to 110.
Yeah, they co-compensate in
some way. So that is very interesting. So you need to go, then you look, and you don't say, therefore, the whole of this is rubbish. That would be the wrong interpretation of it. Much better is to understand exactly what you just said, Charles. How did this individual, in some way, in some autonomic way, compensate for the fact that he's somehow, an outlier in some of these variables? He should have been dead when he was 62, when you plug in these numbers. So I think that's really an interesting,
that's sort
conceptual
of
structure.
That's the Winston Churchill problem. How did Churchill live to be, whatever it was, 92, based on what he did to his body every day?
I'll tell you how he did it. You know how he did it?
No,
I'm going to tell you, this is a very important story. That Churchill insisted every day of his life, his adult life, even during the war, the bombs were dropping on London, the place was going down the tubes, to take a nap. Yes. But 1 second, not just a nap. He insisted, and he said, when you take a nap, you undress and get in your pajamas and you go to bed and you sleep. In that way, you get 2 days for every one. And that's how he lived to 90 years old. So very good advice.
So there's one of the compensating.
That is. That's one of those weirdo.
Yeah. Other questions?
A question for Jeff. To pick it up on what you said about the world's strongest man as being clearly above where he should be. Okay, look at your plot of the mammals, the metabolic rate versus mass. Okay, there's a bit of bouncing in the line. Can you pick out the most efficient mammal? In terms of the greatest metabolic rate?
That way you could, yes.
And what can you learn from that? Which of those points represents the best mammal? And is there some reason for that mammal being the best mammal?
I don't know. No, that would be the philosophy. I don't know the answer to that, but even if you could, you would ask, just as I did there, it's obviously what it's trying to do is abstract from a multidimensional space one or two or small number of variables, make it a parsimonious way of ranking, if you like, in this case, mammals, because you would do it for all these various metrics of mammals and ask them, so for example, you might discover, and we have not done this, and we've done it, ironically, or Luis has done it, I should say, for cities, is you could ask, if this animal is, so to speak, overperforming on metabolic rate, how is that correlated with its lifespan? Because metabolic rate is, in fact, correlated on the average with lifespan. Or how is it correlated with its growth rate? How is it, and so on. And then ask questions about, the individual, not the individual in terms of the species, life history. What has it done to accommodate to this or be more efficient and so forth?
There's a fairly large literature on this.
Yeah.
So when you do it for sort of brain size,
Yeah.
you find that the baleen whales tend to fall below.
Right.
But the killer whales tend to fall above. So you find active predators have more neural capacity per body weight. Mm-hmm. And so there are plenty of examples where they actually fall off the lines. You lose a lot of data on log plots and accounting for the biology. So it's a pretty...
Well, I would have a hunch, if I could make a prediction, that it's somewhere in the middle. Some mammals are too small, some mammals are too big, and in the middle you have the Goldilocks mammals. They're just right. Anyway, that may or may not be true.
I don't think it works. Well, we can talk offline. It doesn't work that way, actually.
No, it doesn't work that way.
Any other questions? Great. Well, please join me in thanking our speakers, and I'd like to thank all of you.
Very good.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks, Charles and Geoffrey, immensely. That was great fun. Thank you. I have just a couple of logistical announcements, please. The reception will begin at the Institute at 6 p.m. For those of you who need transportation, there will be 2 shuttles leaving from the traffic circle directly in front of this building, one at 5:45, the other at 6 p.m. They will be available at the end of the reception to bring you back. If anyone is traveling in their own vehicles and needs directions or has any other questions of any sort, origin and meaning of life or anything like that, please see Casey at the desk. Seriously, Casey and I will be happy to help you with directions or dinner considerations or any other questions you might have. Thanks once again to all our speakers today. It was a really stimulating day. Thank you.